So it's 7:30. We're gonna get started in just a few seconds, but I'm going to get started by introducing myself. My name is Kevin Beebe. I'm the Annual Fund and Donor Relations Specialist with JVC. And welcome to the final JVC Community Conversation for 2021. Tonight's presentation is being recorded. I will let you know, I'll let you all know that again. And before we get started, we'll have our other staff members who are here tonight introduce themselves as well. So let's get started with Emily.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Emily. I contract for JVC and work in their development department, and I am based in Los Angeles. I am an FGV and I served in Tucson in 2017-2018, and I use she or they pronouns. Bryn, you can go next.
Hey everyone, I'm Bryn. I am also contracting for JVC in the development department and have been previously with JVC for the last 2.5 years. And I use she, her pronouns, and I'm currently in San Antonio, Texas. Damika?
Hello everyone, my name is Damika. I work at JVC in the development department. I'm the development associate and I'm located in Baltimore. And I've been with JVC for a little over a month now. Karen.
Thanks, Damika. We used to say it in weeks for Damika. I'm Karen Griffin. And I am the Director of Development at JVC, located here in Baltimore. And really looking forward to hearing Tiger's presentation this evening. I see Chris, would you like to introduce yourself? We're introducing.
Yes, I'm here. Wait, my camera's off. My camera's on now. Hi, everybody. Chris Bargeron. I'm an admissions coordinator at JVC. I've been on staff for over 5 years now. And yeah, excited to be with you all tonight. I think that's it.
So as I previously stated, this is our final community conversation for the year. JVC Community Conversations are workshops and discussions led by like-minded presenters that address key topics of our time as they relate to our core values of spirituality, simple living, community, and social justice. Tonight, we'll be hearing from leadership consultant Tiger Rahman. Tiger maintains 2 professional lives, one as a nonprofit organizational strategist and the other as a student and instructor of yoga and philosophy. Tiger's leadership mission is to improve the way people experience work and thereby the quality of their lives. Tiger's yoga instruction project, Live Your Own Life, centers on practices to help individuals reject narratives of hatred and oppression, develop as anti-racist leaders, and pursue human liberation for themselves and their communities. Tiger has worked in nonprofit organizations since 2009, serving as an AmeriCorps Vista for 2 years in Chicago before joining City Year in 2011. I am always happy to meet and introduce another AmeriCorps alum. I did 2 terms in 2014 and 2015. For the past 7 years, he's worked in program evaluation and organizational improvement, more recently focusing on equitable design and evaluation. Tiger completed a Master of Education in Organizational Leadership and Learning from George Washington University in 2019 and looks forward to opportunities to merge leadership, learning, and spiritual pursuit through Live Your Own Life. And you can follow his work online at his website, liveyourown.life. And so without further ado, here's Tiger.
Thanks. It's so funny. Yeah, I feel like the conversation theme is, thinking about how small and intimate, how conversational, how much presentation, what's the right balance. Also, I feel like I wrote what's probably going to be like a 3-part blog post later. So if you want to read that afterwards, I have a very formal take on this, but hopefully for this next hour or so, we can find a little bit of a middle balance and what feels right with the group, because I do really like to lean into principles of emergent strategy, right, around who the people in the room can have a conversation that only that group of people can have at the time. So I have some slides. I have a whole lecture article thing, and we'll sort of see how that goes. And I wonder if, since it's a relatively small room, I was going to do like a Menti, but maybe we can just do some pop alouds of just starting with naming a little bit about what we're hoping to enter into conversation about today, because that will help me, I think, a little bit find more the right balance for this room right now. And yeah, and then I'll move more specifically to the content part of the evening. But yeah, what's bringing folks here today? You can take a moment to think about it and feel free to speak aloud or to put it in the chat. It's just nice to make a little bit of connection with who's in the room.
I am here because I have found myself really grappling with systems of oppression in our entire culture. And I'm in kind of a career path change. I actually used to work for JVC, but I want to get back into the workforce, but I'm very hesitant because I'm looking at all of our institutions and saying they're built on all of our systems that are perpetually problematic. And so I'm just, yeah, so that's why I'm here. So thanks for being here. Thanks for doing what you're doing.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for being here. That's very helpful. What else is coming up for folks? It's also cool if you're here because it's like, I work here, and so we do this. In which case the rephrase might be, why do you do this?
Hi, I can share. So my name is Lynn. I'm an FJV, and I was just really drawn to the title of this conversation. I was just really drawn to the topic, and I guess I'm here because I don't know where to start. And I work in an organization that has similar values to JVC, but we're still like, where do we start with this work and to do it intentionally? So I'm just interested to hear and to learn.
Cool. Thanks so much for sharing. So a little bit of path seeking, a little bit of path seeking, slightly different places, but looking for some direction. Cool. And then one other question, and this is not as like a pop quiz, this is still just like temperature taking. How familiar are folks? You could like do like a little emoji that expresses how you are feeling in response to this. How familiar are folks with white supremacy culture norms from Dismantling Racism Works? Some side wiggles. I'm seeing 100, some side wiggles, and then some I could use to be oriented to that. Yes? Great, cool, great, perfect. So that'll help me a lot. Let's do the thing. Okay. And I want to still see people's faces. One of the perks about being a data worker is that I've been working with 2 screens for years. So it's very helpful for things like this. So I think I'll walk through, we'll just keep walking through things and we'll see how far we get. So we're doing a little bit of arriving, but as that, I know Kevin just read an introduction for me. Thank you very much. It's weird because I wrote it like a while ago. All of these things I wrote a while ago in the summer, and I was like, oh yeah, it's like a whole end of a year now. So I'll share a little bit about myself and my social location that will hopefully help to contextualize a little bit. And then the main things that came to mind to talk about were centering really what does leadership mean as a leadership mean as a spiritual practice, which may or may not be something that you all think about more often. And then really getting specifically into wrestling with and thinking about white dominant culture norms and white supremacy culture norms. Maybe I'll speak a little bit to that language and how they're related, and specifically about how they crush the spirit and how it's related to spirituality in that sense. And then moving more in that, like, okay, but like, what's the path? What are some options that we can take and how this can connect to different forms of leadership theory? And, you know, this is a conversation. So I'm trying to not just do the like giving a lecture or like teaching a class type thing. We won't do this, but I will share about me. So my name's Rahman. The H is kind of hard, sort of like at the back of the throat. And I use they, them, theirs, and he, him, his pronouns. I use both sets really based on where I am. So when I'm in groups of more trans folks, I'm more likely to just lean with the he, him, his pronouns. In other spaces, I more use they, them, theirs, just to clarify about that. I am Black, queer, transmasculine, and socialized as a girl and raised in Islam. I am a Libra sun, Aries moon, Scorpio rising, which is important. My ed background, I went to boarding school, a prep school in New England for high school, stayed out there for my undergrad at Dartmouth. And then I did the grad school thing. I dropped out once in information systems. So I spent a lot of time studying databases and information design and business system analysis and all sorts of technical things. And then I went back to grad school later to study organizational leadership and learning, where I focused on strategic decision-making in organizations and some of these different leadership theories that we're talking about today, as well as how do adults learn differently and what does that mean when we abstract it up to organizations, communities, et cetera. I mentioned in the break before that I decided to not live in a van, but to buy a house. So I am seated on Osage lands that was colonized by the French in the 17th century and then signed over to the United States government in treaty in the 19th century. And yeah, really my world's contribution is around bringing together all of these things that maybe sound very disparate and trying to bring them together. So for me in my day job, that is in this evaluation and research, and really thinking about how can organizations be more critical about what we're offering and hold ourselves to account for what we're telling communities that we're offering. And then also within organizations, they're all made of people. So for me, starting to study yoga and yogic philosophy was actually an extension of my graduate study. To me, it didn't feel complete without learning more about these really deep and old systems that get into how we can understand our own self-awareness and really understand ourselves from the inside out, because all of leadership is ultimately about one person at a time. And depending on how self-aware, how self-composed, how clear in our guidance each leader is, that's sort of what we get in our leadership process. And my leadership mission statement was shared before, but this is how it comes together for me. I always like to do teacher and influence acknowledgement. So the photos on the top are teachers that I've studied with more in person. Stacy Berry's on the left, Susanna Barkatakis on the right. And then also there are teachers that I've been able to study with more easily now because the pandemic, everything is digital. So Kaya Minlin, Livena Rangel, and Swami A. Parthasarathy. I'll mention a little bit more about his teaching in the Vedanta Institute, potentially. Yeah, and a lot of this also is informed by this sort of bringing together of study of the Bhagavad Gita, of trauma-informed practices with Peter Walker's work, Dr. Gail Parker, and then I mentioned a little bit before the work of Tema Okun, dismantling racism works, and Bobby Harrow, who did work on cycles of socialization, which I'll maybe talk about a little bit, and Barbara Love, who is a semi-local practitioner who's been doing race-based healing work for a while. I just like to name teachers and where things are coming from, because it's not that any of these things are uniquely my own. I'm just bringing things together in different ways. And so just because the yoga part often throws people of like, you focus on leadership and therefore you study and like lean in from the yoga perspective. This is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. It's one of the first definitions that Krishna gives to Arjuna, while Arjuna is sort of in this quandary about how do you expect me to do this thing in the world? I don't want to take these actions. I don't like this decision or what you're telling me my job is. And Krishna says, you don't need to worry about that, but you do need to become a master of yoga because you are losing it right now. This is a strong paraphrase. And so we get this introduction into this idea of yoga being perfect evenness of mind. And this is really important and related to the topic of white dominant culture and specifically white supremacy culture norms and how they really kind of pull us out of this perfect evenness of mind that is allowing us to have access to this clarity of vision that spirituality provides and really pulls us into this sort of messy muddiness of the world. Let's see if I want to share any of these other slides right now. Nope. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just share a little bit in more of a face-to-face sort of way. And yeah, definitely feel free to, interrupt to ask questions. It's not an interruption. This is a conversation. So when I think about spirituality, and I've shared a little bit already, I grew up Muslim, and I think there were sort of these two phases for me. One where I understood religion, Islam, as engaging in specific behaviors and reading the Quran and fasting during Ramadan and wearing hijab on Saturdays when I'd go to Saturday school, things like that. And I, especially more in middle school, got to start seeing a different side, a more Gnostic side of Sufism through chanting and really more of this devotional practice and recognizing that there are these qualities of the divine that we can't exactly hold on to. And so there are all of these names and concepts, and we repeat those and keep them in mind as something that we want to hold with us, something that we want to aspire towards or to reflect in the world, right? So the idea of being benevolent and merciful, my last name actually is one of the 99 names. Rahman means servant of the most benevolent. And so in that, there is this very different sense of sort of quieting down away from a lot of formal structure to make some space where you can see and feel more clearly a right way of being, not in a dogmatic sense, but more in a heart-led sense. And so for me, very early on, spirituality was sort of this awe and reverence at the feeling of a clarity of purpose and action that I could feel on a day-to-day as sort of a worldview. And so in yogic philosophy, there are, I love it because it's so systematic. Within it, there is sort of this sense of everything being a combination of consciousness and then nature, and together is where all of the things come from. And then from that, we start to get this sense of individuation, right? Where does the self that we think we are come from? And so within that, there are specifically 3 qualities that are talked about that everything in matter is made of. And those are tamas, rajas, and sattva. And I'll introduce these a little bit more visually because philosophy sometimes is like, why are we talking about this? So this idea of consciousness and primordial nature, Purusha and Prakriti. From there, there's this intellect that is capable of discerning the natural order from projections of reality. And I'm doing sort of an above and below thing here. It's not, necessarily that linear, but this sense of there is everything that is possible, right? All of consciousness, all unmanifest nature. And then there's the stuff that we are, right? And that includes who each of us think we are, right? So this is where we get this idea of myself, my self-identity, my personhood, for people interested in astrology, your first house, your rising sign, a little bit of your sun sign, right? So these sorts of things are this bigger picture. And then we get into these qualities. So Thomas, I mentioned, and all of these images here I'm trying to relate to like the world of work and organizations because I think they'll resonate more. So Thomas is seen as this thing that we sort of get stuck in, right? It is sort of this state of being a little bit more listless, of being drawn down, of being held back, maybe. You can also think of it as where you are depressed or feeling purposeless. So all of this is part of tamas, which is one of three aspects. It's also where we get like really solid things like rocks and everything that we can really hold on to. So it's very important. Rajas is the state of more busyness and activity. And so this is where on its own, it's how things happen, but also if you're just in that state, you can maybe feel like you don't have breaks, right? So this can turn into the feeling of being stuck on a hamster wheel, sort of constantly going, but not getting anywhere, right? And so this can also manifest in states of anxiety, of overwhelm, of feeling like we're subject to all of these things that are really guiding our actions and determining what they are, but it's not really coming from a state of clarity, right? We feel like we're always catching up and maybe not actually guiding ourselves anywhere. Generally, I would say if you're stuck in this state, you're probably not able to be that effective as a leader, right? How are you leading others when you're constantly just catching up? So there's that. And then this last state is sattva, which I could not really figure out a good image for that wasn't of people meditating. And that didn't feel like it was very helpful. But this is where we get this sense of really careful observation and discernment. So in sort of like the Western schema where we talk a lot about objectivity, which maybe isn't real, the closest thing to that might be the state where you're more able to be a little bit more discerning, to notice all of the things and what they are really standing for and representing, including the parts of it that you don't like, and then able to make more of a clear decision. So this example around van life or house, right? You might come to the realization that actually, like, I want to live in nature and that being nomadic and being able to do that is more important and I can support my lifestyle. And in this sort of state where it comes in as a yogic practice, because this just sounds like a quality right now, is that perfect evenness of mind is what allows us to recognize like, hey, actually, I'm the kind of person who would prefer to work remotely while living in a van, right? We can notice it afterwards and we can still course correct. It's not that like what's in the past is a disaster and like we need to give up, but also for going forward, how can we get to the place where we feel more clear to make the right decision in advance before we're trying to like clean up or rectify the situation? So that's a little bit about where these three states come in. And I mention them because I will probably just mention the terms offhandedly. And so naming that. The the Swami that I study with, Parthasati in the Vedanta Institute, would also probably name that this is really where intellectual rule comes in. So sometimes we call this logic and reasoning, and it's not one that is cold and emotionless. It's just recognizing like, hey, I'm having a feeling. What information is that feeling giving me? And then where is that information in respect to all of the other information about the decision that I have to make? And thinking about this at the very personal level is the easiest way to start, but this also applies, right, to a conversation I was in earlier today was around equitable salaries and whether it makes more sense to take more of a redistribution approach for where senior leaders should have lower salaries in order to cover for lower salaries that others get, or if you actually need to do something like explore other funding pipelines, if you need to do more funder and donor education so that people recognize like, actually, this is why we need this amount, even though we've been operating on, you know, 3/4 of the cost before, right? We were doing that. It wasn't necessarily equitable. And this industry was created on white supremacy norms that honestly was trying to preserve the funds of some of the richest people in America. And so they created nonprofits as a way of saving themselves tax money and looking good at the same time. So hopefully this is how it's connected to the topic in case we don't get all the way to the punchline. Any just like clarifying questions of like, I can't go on until you clarify something right now? Sweet. And so this idea of leadership as a spiritual practice, to me, is really set within one of the key principles that's in the Bhagavad Gita, which is really focusing on the idea of karma yoga, which we'll say translates to using all of your actions as a devotional practice. Let's say that that's what that means, right? So in this sense, we get these ideas of, especially the idea of, you know, don't be concerned with the fruits of your labor, just focus on what the task is, where you can put yourself and apply yourself. And so leadership in itself is a process, right? There are leaders, each of us can be leaders. Together, when we are working on something, we are engaging in a leadership process. And that's where we as leaders are seeking to follow through on what will lead us and others, if there are other people involved, to an identified goal. We can also engage in self-leadership, where we're simply identifying a goal just for us, and then we are doing the work of leading ourselves to it. So we can see all of these different examples, right, where even in a small event, there are different leadership roles that might take place. Sometimes things are very emergent, sometimes leadership is sort of taken by brute force. But in any of these scenarios, there is some effort at looking for an ability to get to a place. And so for me, when I think about that, you know, we can get bogged down in sort of the positionality and the power aspects of it, of, you know, I have a director title or a senior vice president title or whatever. But it's really more around this alignment of our values with our behaviors and our ability to be consistent in that towards that goal. And I think that this creates this opportunity for spiritual practice, because we get to really hone in on what truly are, you know, fully, comprehensively, holistically, what truly are my values. And then if I were entirely orienting my action towards those actions, towards those values, what would I do, right? So when we take our actions more intentionally and moving with care from one to the next, we get the opportunity to really test our relationship with those values and ideals. And I think this is so valuable because, you know, in yoga and maybe in other traditions as well, there's this recognition that, you know, each moment is a new beginning, right? So it's not that we've ever fallen off the path, right? There are times when we did things where we did not have the power of intellect or that access to that more sattvic principle of ourselves to make the better decision. We always make the best decision that's available to us. But then all sorts of things can come into play, right? We have our own traumas. We are born into these systems that throw oppression on us in different ways. And so this is really just an invitation, whether it's for self-leadership or leading groups and organizations, of how are we moving with intention towards our most ultimate values all the time. And I think here too, there's this aspect of recognizing that these values are, you know, it shouldn't feel like, oh, I have values when I'm with my spiritual community and then I have different values for work, right? They might manifest in different ways. That would make sense, right? You're not going to preach to somebody at work necessarily, but why should it be that the values themselves differ? If I care about humanity universally when I'm in a spiritual context, then how does that need to show up when I'm making business decisions that is still caring for people as much as possible? And that doesn't always mean that we are completely successful, right? We work with other people. There are conflicting agendas, but that alignment and that consistency of how much can I practice? There's a phrase that I like that Kaya uses a lot, of putting your coconut in the fire. So backing up, there's a lot of fire rituals in Hinduism. And in one such, you offer a coconut as a representation of your head, of your ego, right? So this idea of this is like, has nothing to do with me. I'm simply a conduit, right, of working towards these values and expressing, and like so much so that like my ego is out the door. I'm gonna put my ego in the fire. I think it's funny. Yeah. So when we take living as this kind of active verb of a conscious decision, then choosing to live our own lives is actually an assertion of both great liberty and massive responsibility. So it's not about letting go and taking no accountability for each moment. Instead, it's really about harnessing that confidence and clarity to follow through on your values as consistently as possible. Really leaning into consistency and values. There's a theme here. I'm gonna pivot into white dominant culture and then leadership frames, but still pausing. Somebody let me know there's nothing in the chat. Okay, cool. So white dominant culture. I'll first specify, I generally lean in on white supremacy culture norms as the term that I will use more for this, in recognizing that there are norms around a culture that have been established to protect white supremacy, and not white supremacy as in like Ku Klux Klan, but white supremacy as in the idea that whiteness, which is often seen visually through skin tone, is supreme. We also recognize that whiteness itself is not just skin tone, right? But that it over time has become interchangeable, intermingled is probably more correct, with practicing the culture norms themselves. So I and other BIPOC folks can be very much upholding whiteness. We can be practicing white dominant culture norms. We can sometimes be even more explicitly making it clear that they are in fact white supremacy culture norms. And sometimes we don't even notice it, right? So I'll just intro with that and do a little bit of backup to set this up, because I think when we don't explain things well, we can get confused, stuck, lost, and then start fighting with ourselves or each other. So a book that I am honestly still working through, because it's very massive, is Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. So not How to Be an Anti-Racist, that's got a more casual tone. Stamped from the Beginning is just sort of a historical tome, which the audiobook is very nice. And right towards the beginning, he lays out in pretty extensive detail how a culture of whiteness began to arise out of a need to replace a distinction that Christianity itself had previously provided. So one of the things that was an immediate challenge, and we do this actually all the time, there's the sort of replacement that happens when our worldviews and what we're actually doing don't line up. And this is not new at all. So at that point in time, there was this question of how to reconcile this idea that humans are made in God's image, and that, also at the same time that we can enslave humans, right? That being part of it. And one of the elegant things there to do is, okay, let's renegotiate what this is. And part of this too is because they were, wanting or starting to do more conversion of slaves into Christianity. So previously there had been sort of a blanket statement of no Christian can be enslaved. This is a problem if now slaves are Christians. And so that basically moved to, let's specify actually that this is about this other marker of whiteness, which is more delineating, for example, tribes that are coming out of biblical tradition, right? So one lineage has a curse on it, the other doesn't. It's okay, everyone can be Christian, but these are like the original good folks, and you can tell because they've got very light, pure skin, right? And so within that, what was really nuanced and elegant about that too, and I think sometimes I've been in conversations with folks around like, is systemic racism or classism the greater problem? And what's interesting here is that we do get to see that even European indentured servants in this context had a higher status, right, and could enact violence and all sorts of things on slaves in part, and could never become slaves, right? Even if in other terms, some of their work or behaviors might have been similar in terms of what they were being asked to do, that there is still now this codification where legally you have a higher status, not simply because you're not a formal slave, but because you are not even eligible to enter into this category. So for me, and I think many people, sort of the race-based distinction gives way more to especially how we've seen classism break out in America. But that's a little bit of an aside. A thing too about this, which I think is important, right, is that in these foundations, especially in early Protestantism, we start seeing a lot of this idea of liberty get wrapped up with material wealth, with property acquisition, and really that conflation of ability to own in amount and volume had more to do with the idea of this is how you are realizing your potential as God's creation. This is how you are demonstrating your goodness. And this invites in all sorts of things that we're now wading through, right? Of meritocracy, capitalism, free market economics. Obviously, some of these things existed before, but they really got steeped in as kind of hallmarks of Americanism, and specifically this new culture of whiteness. And this is where I think it would be helpful to pull up the white dominant culture norms. I'll put in links to the site now that they've redone. And the characteristics themselves, which I guess they call them characteristics, not culture norms anymore. But there's a great illustration up here, which I'll put on the screen. And so in this, they're talking about a culture is a way of life of a group of people, right? So some of the things that are in here, we get either or thinking, this sort of, it's got to be one or the other, right? You're on my team, you're off my team. You're rich or you're poor, you're black or you're white. Worship of the written word, right? It's sort of, it's not real unless it's written down, unless it's like the written law. Objectivity, we talked about here, seen not as the seeing it for what it is, but the idea that you can actually purely know, right? The idea that a fact is a fact and it can't be changed, rather than that facts for you may be experienced differently than facts for me. There is no pure objective reality that we can experience and share with each other. We get individualism, quantity over quality, power hoarding, fear of open conflict. Fear is, I think, just generally, it's been reframed just like fear generally. Sense of urgency, defensiveness, paternalism, progress is bigger or more, right? So you know you're doing well if you're able to scale your organization, if you're able to have more employees, if you have more money, whatever this bigger aggrandizement is always what progress means. It's hard to frame for us to automatically think about, oh yeah, sometimes progress is less. I would love for my calendar to be emptier while also still making enough money. That would be amazing progress. Belief in one right way, that there is like a best way to do things and we should always do things that way. This right to comfort, which is also where, you know, if you're familiar with the idea of white comfort and preserving white comfort, that falls into that realm. And perfectionism, everyone's favorite, which ties into a lot of these other things, right? So a lot of these are impossible to begin with. If you want to spend more time with them, if you scroll down on the characteristics page, there, I recommend reading the middle too, but each one sort of has extended conversation. Some of them have alternate forms that you can experience them as. So I recommend checking this out. It's a great resource if you're not already familiar. And so part of it really this is because a lot of this is where we start getting tripped up, right? So where we get tripped up and what gives us this opportunity for practice, right? And each moment of practice is an opportunity to strengthen our spiritual growth. And so within this, you know, we get even this initial idea of who I am I'm going to go to this slide first. Make this a little bigger. So sorry, this is a little fuzzy. All right, so when we are talking about this self and really wanting to show up and living our own lives in this way that we're talking about in terms of being accountable for our actions and authenticity being tied to knowing our values and living them out in each moment. And the yogic philosophy, there's this idea of the kleshas, which just means obstacles. And there's 5 of them. I've compressed them into 4 bullets because 2 are a pair. And so we first start with this ignorance of our true nature, right? We wake up in this body and we're like, hey, my name is Tiger, I'm 35, whatever else comes with that, right? This is a surface level compared to the spirit level that is transcendent, right, within this philosophy view. And so this sort of ignorance of our true nature, of our alignment and connection with divinity, however it works for you to think about that, is sort of this first obstacle that really keeps us from even recognizing that this is something that's possible for us, right? To live in this sort of consistent flow in alignment. The second is the development of our ego, which happens fairly quickly. I sometimes wonder, it's like, do you think babies remember their last life and they just can't talk about it yet? And then by the time they can talk, they've forgotten, or they've been re-socialized to someone else, right? So this is especially when we're coming in of like, hello, my name is Tiger, I'm a researcher, whatever. The real kickers are in the last three, right? So we're socialized to like things, and usually that's reinforced by micro rewards, right? So when we are kids, we're perhaps, you know, treated really well when we get an A on things, when we have really thin boundaries and share things very freely with people, when we don't talk to strangers. So there's all of these places where we can get socialized of like, these are the things that we like. You should be like this. You shouldn't be like that. And there's also then micro punishments, right? Where if we talk to kids that our parents think are bad, or we're watching the wrong TV shows that are, you know, not aligned with beliefs that match up with your house. There's all of these places where we start to develop an attraction towards some things and aversion towards other. Problem is that if we wanted to be able to look at things more objectively, we'd need to be able to actually hold both and not actually say like, this is good or this is bad. It's just that these are two things. And then the last really is this aspect of fear, that our bodies will end, that will sort of come to a close, but also just safety, right? The basic of, I need to make sure that moms and dad are like taking care of me, right? Like I need to keep these people on my side. Later, this might be your boss, the CEO, the police, whatever. And so there are all these places where there are these obstacles that come in through socialization, through our own internal experience, that really make it harder for us to be that true, authentic self. Noticing that I've just been talking because I have like 12 pages of content here that I could talk about, but I want to talk specifically about some leadership frames and things we can do, practice, engage with. So with authentic leadership in particular, to me, this is the most important starting point. Been sort of leaning in on authenticity the whole time. This first piece of self-awareness, right, of knowing what our values are and then really taking it as our internalized moral perspective, that compass that lets us know, like, if I have to make a decision, this is the information by which I will make a decision, are really, really key, right? If we don't have that, then really in any sort of spiritual practice, it's kind of hard to follow through. We can be doing the actions, but there's no understanding or heart behind it, really. The balanced processing aspect is that activity of really listening to both sides, right? This is a little bit of a national crisis right now, global even, that the way that the way that technology is built, these new neural networks and ways that we think about creating information and knowledge is doing exactly the opposite of what actually promotes unity. Right? It is deeply selecting particular pathways, the same as our own brains do when we're always just choosing what we like because somebody told us before that that was the good thing. It's the same thing. Yeah, machine learning, your brain, they're modeled after, well, your deep learning is modeled after your brain, but. And then relational transparency is sort of that last key thing. I think I gave an example where our values, we just want to know what our values are. They're not conditional, but the way that we apply them and enact them varies, right? So relational transparency is recognizing that when I show up in this space, I am Tiger, researcher, data jockey, yoga student, astrologer, all of these things. And the way that you'll experience that right now is through one particular lens. I'm also the same person when I go down the hall to have dinner with my partner, but there I have to get consent to talk about work before we do that, because we don't talk about work after some appointed time, depending on the day. And so there's just different ways that we show up, right? We have different roles. They shift from room to room, conversation to conversation. And so we're constantly needing to check, where am I? What am I to this person and in this space, and how is that showing up? The last piece that I'll really get into is this idea of adaptive leadership. And in super short form, it's just that we can often get stuck in thinking that because all of this work is like deep, big systems change, that no individual can really do anything about it. There's sort of the obvious answer of like, okay, but if everyone's feeling like that, right? The whole thing of there's somebody sick on the train and nobody calls because somebody thinks that everyone else is going to do it. So there's that, but there's also this aspect that when we behave consistently in alignment with our values in a constant way that is appropriate to the moment in the scenario, that we are doing that modeling. And I love last week in a session I do these leadership circles. Somebody said, I really hate the idea of role modeling. It feels so disingenuous. I was like, yeah, that's because you're like putting a role on instead of being yourself. Like you are just modeling by existing. The question is, what are you? So if you have to be something else to be modeling the thing, that's the actual problem, not that the idea of role modeling is bad. And so then it's much more of like, I can show up authentically. And in doing that, I can find people who are like-minded, who want to go to this other place with me, who want to help me build that. And we can go together, right? This is where we get sort of a ripple effect or a fractal, that we can each start building that out in our own. But when we're not consistent and we're not doing that all the time, then yeah, it's like I'm really frustrated about these things that I'm not practicing either, and no one knows. So who will join me? So that's sort of the casual take on that. I've talked for too long. People have been very quiet and there's nothing in the chat. What's on top?
It's a lot of information, and I and I'm trying to synthesize, and particularly when Kelly and I think Lynn spoke about moving into the job market. How do you know when your values and the values of a place you might want to work have a meld? I mean, I think this is it's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also difficult because employers are kind of selling themselves, right? Like they want you to think that they're amazing. So what they put out on top is like not particularly helpful all the time. I think things that I look for, because also I was doing some job hunting this year, and so I got to wonder around that, is, I mean, there's the first piece of knowing which values you're looking for. The tricky thing is to start thinking about what behaviors demonstrate alignment with that. And so, I think especially as you're interviewing, because it's hard to do without really talking to the folks, there's space to ask things like, I really love even seeing it in org charts and how people like know that different departments talk to each other. Like so in the eval space, I asked a question like, what's your relationship with the IT group and who's in charge of developing your database? I know what my values aligned answer would be, that it's participatory, or that their group who has all the expertise is sort of leading and that the IT group is trying to help execute. And that if that's not true, it's like, oh, I don't want to be in that world. Like, been there, done that. It's super messy. I spend all of my time trying to prove that I know what I'm talking, but I don't have time for that. So that's one example. I think I mean, it really comes down to just being really comfortable with asking the question you actually want the answer to. One of my favorite questions to also ask is sort of like, what concerns do you have about me as a candidate? Because some people are thrown by that of like, oh, we don't talk about that. And it's like, you don't, I mean, that to me is like, we're going to have a hard time having a conversation. Yeah, things like that. I think being a little bit, it's odd because you kind of have to apply some of the comfort that you would have if you already worked there for 5 years, of could I actually get to that point where you can respect that I asked that question and I respect your answer? If that doesn't go well, it feels a little flaggy. I don't know if that helps. That's my take.
No, thank you. That was very, very specific, and the examples helped a lot.
I'll name as, because yeah, I think there's a lot of information, and some of it I include just in, I think yoga is so often seen as just like something you do on a mat. And so I'm constantly trying to, encourage us to think about the fact that it's like, actually it offers a system for thinking about literally the structure of everything in the universe. So that's kind of cool, succinctly too. Yeah, I think the simplest way to start though is just by looking at what you've done in a day and seeing which things felt like they were really in alignment for you, as sort of like a self-assessment, like, where am I? Like, how much am I doing things because I'm afraid of somebody else's reaction, because I really don't like something, I avoided doing something on my list, the other way around. You can start seeing where these obstacles are coming up for you. So it feels information heavy, but it's also oddly intuitive, right? All right, hard-hitting question. What does sattva look like within a culture that has done that dismantling? Yeah. So I think sattva being that quality of clarity, right? So I imagine a society where where we are not pro-conflict, but not against conflict, right? I think there's this really important recognition that in order to be fair with each other, we have to come right up to one another and see, where is my thinking butting up against your thinking? And then what will you consent to? What will I consent to? How can we negotiate with that? These are all things that are not in the comfort zone in our culture, right? We dodge culture. If we have to negotiate something, it's like, oh my gosh, can't you just tell me what to do and I'll just say yes so that we don't have to talk about it? So I think in that sense, right, this having this really clear groundedness of, I am safe. You are not harming me with your question. You are asking me a question for information, right? So that we can make a better choice that works for both of us. I think trying to give a really specific example, I think that in that space, you start seeing space for decision making that just feels fundamentally different. Certainly more compromise, potentially more consensus based, though consensus can take a long time. So you'd see a decrease in urgency. You'd see a lot more gray space, so less either or thinking. I'm basically going through the white supremacy culture norms list right now. Yeah. So, and I think we're technically at time. I know someone just came in the room, so I'm cool with hanging out. I don't, yeah. Other people are in charge here.
Thank you so much, Tiger. I have to jump, unfortunately, but it was so great. I'm definitely going to be doing a lot of Googling later tonight. Have a great night, everybody.
Yeah, good night. I suppose I can, because I will, most of any writing type stuff I do, I put on my blog. So the other 4 pages of whatever I wrote at 5 in the morning, I'll post on there. But I also have some writing around white supremacy culture norms on the blog around emotional intelligence in the workplace, things like that. So feel free to check that out. And I teach classes sometimes. Trying to keep that in the middle because the full-time day job. But mostly I'm just doing leadership circles right now. So working with groups of people who want to focus on leadership and think about it in this kind of way. But yeah, and if anybody else has other questions, thoughts, Danielle, if you want to catch up sometime, because I think time zones are hard. Happy to do any of that.
So could I ask Kelly if there were specific things that she was thinking about when she decided to join this conversation?
I want to be sure I understand your question. I mean, I think that I was just looking to kind of see where the conversation was going to go. I got a lot of, I think, food for thought in the conversation. I was very pleased with just like even random things. I'm like, ooh, that's such a good idea. Like those questions you threw out for the interview thing. I was like, that was awesome. I think it's about like I really appreciated the authenticity and like thinking through like how do we like internally look at be our authentic selves in order to like continue to like dismantle the systems as they are. So I really appreciate that. So I don't know if I answered your question, Karen, but
Absolutely, thank you. When we started with the community conversations, we were trying to lift up different voices. And what I would have answered Tiger's question, the first one he asked, is this has been such a rich resource for me to hear different experiences than I would have in my normal day-to-day, interactions. And so over the last 12 months, we've had amazing speakers with such a depth of experience and a willingness to share that with us at JVC. So I've grown so much, and because it's all about me. Sorry. But really wanting to know what other people would like to continue to see in this space, because it is a space that allows us to have different time zones and not have to buy a ticket to something, or somewhere, and exposure to different opinions and thought trains. So anyway, so thanks.
And if no one has any other questions, I think we can start to wrap it up for tonight. So I will say again, thank you, Tiger, for your presentation tonight. And thank you all again for joining us. As we have said, this is the last community conversation of 2021, but we will be back in 2022. We'll announce future speakers and topics coming soon. You can follow us at all the links that you will find in the chat. It's how you can support current JVs who are continuing their year of service, and find out more information about future events and more information about JVC. We are in the second week of Advent, so we hope you have a very blessed Advent season for the rest of this, and we hope you have a very Merry Christmas and a wonderful rest of 2021. So thank you all for joining us, and have a great night.